Hi everyone. This week we're going to be going over CSS selectors and pseudo selectors. Sorry about the fact that we couldn't have in-person class. Just there were time conflicts within the staff this week, but don't expect there to be any time conflicts in the future. Yeah, so let's get into it. Just some announcements. The ad deadline is tomorrow, so if you haven't used your enrollment code or if you're having issues, let us know, because after tomorrow you won't be able to get units for this class. Homework 1 and homework 2, which will be released today, will both be due next Thursday before lecture starts. And then lab 1 will be due next Monday before lab starts. Office hours and emails. If you want like more in-depth help, please visit us at office hours. And you just have logistical questions, feel free to post on Ed or also just email us. And then for the GitHub submission setup, please finish it as soon as possible. We're still missing a lot of links, and we'll have no way to grade your work if you don't actually submit your GitHub link to your cohort leader. But yeah, from last week, we learned about HTML. So here are just some like cheat sheet notes. These are just some like common tags that you might want to use in terms of like, I don't know, UL and like lists or divs. Yeah, these are just kind of cheat sheet notes. Feel free to reference it whenever you're working on like homework or projects. But yeah, I'm not going to be going into the super detail right now because we did that last lecture. Yeah. Oh yeah. So basically last week we did HTML, which is basically how every single website on the internet is structured. And now we're going to get into like what differentiates between websites, like how they look and how they're designed. And how you design it is with CSS. So starting off with like how to link CSS to your HTML files. Inside the head tag that we discussed last lecture, you're just gonna want to add this like link rel equals style sheet type is text/CSS, and then the href is the relative path from the index.html to the CSS folder. So you can see in index.html, you start off in this directory and you go into assets and you go into styles, and then style.css is where your CSS file will be located. And yeah, you can just copy and paste this into your code just because it's like super common. You don't have to remember it, but after using it enough times, you'll probably end up remembering it just by using it a lot. But yeah, this is pretty much how you link CSS to HTML so you can control how your HTML looks. And yeah, we'll get into some CSS syntax now. So basically, this might look a little bit intimidating, but it kind of reads similar to English, where basically H1 is one of the HTML elements that you're trying to style. So as you remember last week, we talked about like header tags. So H1 is one of the header tags. And within these curly braces, we have the CSS properties. So for example, if you want to change like the text color to blue, you put color, which is the CSS property, and then the property value of blue. And then always after every CSS, I guess declaration, put a semicolon to separate the properties. If you don't do this, you might run into some random issues where some of the elements won't be styled correctly. So just make sure to put a semicolon after. If you want to change the background to gray, it's like the same styling. So you have background, colon, and then gray with the semicolon at the end. Yeah. So I guess this is kind of what the index.html file would look like. So as you see in our head tag, we have the link rel equals style sheet type is text.css, and then you have the href pointing to the style.css. In this case, the index.html and style.css files are located within the same directory, which is why the file path is just style.css. And you can see the CSS file on the right, which is basically just changing the width of divs. And we can get more into that here. So as you can see, if we want to change the width of the entire div, as you can see, there's a div and there's H1 and a P tag nested within it. So what this CSS will do will change the div width to 200 pixels, change the background of beige, also change the color to dark blue. If we want to style something within that div, we can have H1 and we can just change the font size to 32 pixels, font family to Arial, and this will basically control how your page looks. And if you want to see what it actually looks like, there's a link here to check it out. Yeah. So kind of getting more into in depth about what we were talking about earlier about selectors. So selectors basically tell us what elements in the HTML file to apply the CSS to, like the CSS properties. So if we put div, then we're styling all the div elements. And this is really powerful in terms of being able to select multiple things at once. For example, say you wanted to turn all the divs with the background color of like red or something. You don't want to have to like manually go through every single div and put red. Instead, you can just use this selector and it'll apply to all the divs in the file. Yeah, and then as we said before, properties and values. So property is defining like what we're changing about the element in particular. So whether it's like font size, like the color of the div, anything like that. And the value is basically what we want to change like the property to. So we want the font size to be 32 pixels and we want the color to be green. And then together they form like a declaration or rule. And after every rule, remember to put a semicolon so that they're separated. Yeah, so I guess rules for a selector fall between curly braces. You might see like these curly braces. You might have seen them if you've done some coding in the past. Yeah, and then make sure to put the colon between every single rule. And also if you want to put comments in your code, you can just use the slash and then the asterisk, and then yeah, you can kind of see what it looks like here. Oh yeah, we can get into CSS selectors now. So the question is like, oh, what if we have all these p tags, but what if I don't want all of them to look the same? What you might try to do is like put color green and then color blue, but the way that CSS works is that it goes from like top to bottom. So first it'll change all the p tags to blue, like green, so all the text will be green. And then afterwards, it'll change all the p tags to blue. So in the end, what's rendered when you look at the index.html file is that all the p tags are blue. And we don't want that because we want green text and then blue text, and we want more green text at the end. So in order to fix this, we can use classes and IDs. So basically what classes are is if you want to apply a specific rule to certain elements on the page, but they're not like one of the HTML elements. So you have like for HTML elements, you like p tags, like div tags, other stuff. But if you want to create like your own way to select a certain tag, you could use classes, and classes apply to like multiple elements. So like if you want both of these to be green, you would use classes equal to green. In the CSS, you denote it with like a period and then green, and then that will basically get all the div or all the HTML elements that have green as one of their classes. And then IDs are basically if you just want a one-time styling to a specific element. So since there's only one blue text, we could just do ID equals blue, and then we have the hashtag blue, and then we change the color to blue. Yeah, so as I said before, classes apply a set of rules to multiple elements on the page. So if you want to apply like a specific styling to say all the buttons on the page, then you could put classes equal to, I don't know, green button, and then you could do dot green button, and then in the CSS, and then change the color. So yeah, for HTML, add the class attribute to like the opening tag. So you see there's like the P, and then you have the class, and then the closing angle bracket, and then you have like whatever is in like the tag, so green text, and then another /P. And then for CSS, put a period in front of the class name as a selector. That's just how CSS denotes how to select classes. And the ID is if you want to set like a set of rules to one distinct element on the page. So you can use the ID attribute like and put it also in like the opening tag, so ID equals blue, and make sure to remember like the quotes around it for both the classes and the IDs, just because it won't really work if you don't have them. And then for CSS, use a hashtag in front of like the ID name if you want to select it, and then you can just change the color to blue. Yeah, so I guess say you want to select multiple elements and you want to apply like the same rule to all of them. As you can see, like if you have like two p tags and a div, and they all have different classes and IDs, then you might want to like, you might be wondering like, oh, how can I apply like one styling to all three of them? And basically what you do is like basically combining the information from before. You can just select like every class and then put commas in between them with spaces. So this rule will be applied to all elements with the class 1, all elements with the class 2, and all elements with the ID of 3. And this will basically allow you to select multiple elements. Make sure to remember like the commas in between them, because we'll get into something later that if you don't have the comma, then it'll be about that concept instead of this one. So if you want to select an element with multiple names, you can have like multiple class names within a div. So you would separate them with like green space big. And in this case, this p tag, the first p tag, has the class of green and big. And if you want to select only tags with both green and big as their class, then you're going to want to put dot green dot big with no space in between. This basically selects all elements with like green and big set within the class. And then the CSS will only apply to like this first p tag because it has green and big, but the second one only has big, so it won't apply. You can also do dot big dot green and it'll be the same thing. But yeah, this is how you add multiple classes to one HTML element, and this is how you select it in CSS. Yeah, so say you want to like have, you say you have an element nested with another element and you only want to apply styling to the nested element. So you would add like a space in between the selectors. So say we want to style like this p tag. We can't just put p because this will style like both of these. So if we want to select all the elements with like the class park that are nested within the ID of j, then we do hashtag j, and then you have a space and then the period park. So this is kind of how you select it. Make sure not to put a comma here, because if you don't have the comma, then this is how you CSS knows you're nesting things. Whereas 2 pages ago, we had the comma because we were trying to select multiple things at the same time. Yeah, so this will only apply to the first p tag, it won't apply to the second one, just because we have this nested structure. And then for our last section, we can kind of get into pseudo selectors. So basically pseudo selectors are where you can select elements that change appearance based on like a certain state. So the normal pseudo selector structure is like you have like a selector, like a CSS selector that we're talking about, and then a pseudo class. And I think pseudo class might sound pretty intimidating, but basically the pseudo class is just like a word that indicates like when to apply the styling. So the rules will only be applied when the cursor is hovering over the div. So that's why we have like div and then colon, and the pseudo class is hover. And then this will basically change the font size of 32 pixels and the color to green when you're hovering over the div. And yeah, so here are some other pseudo classes. So we went over hover, there's visited. So if a link isn't visited before, then you might want to change like the purple hyperlink that you might have seen on like Google to some other, I don't know, some other styling. And then we can have like the dot active or colon active. It's like when the mouse is currently clicked on an element, that you want to like increase the size of something. Yeah, there's a lot of applications for pseudo classes. It's just up to you to play around with them. Yeah, I guess the summary is that like CSS is used to change like what HTML looks like, because usually we don't really like looking at, I don't know, ugly websites. So CSS is pretty much how you style everything. You put in a separate file, usually called style.css, and then you link it to the HTML with this link tag in the head tag of the HTML file. And this is kind of what CSS looks like as we went over earlier. Yeah, so to reiterate over one like selector summary, if you want to apply CSS to one HTML tag, we use the h1 tag and the rules within it. If you want to apply the CSS to a class of elements, you use the period and then the class name and then all the rules within it. And then if you want to apply the CSS to one element, you put the ID in the element in the opening tag in the HTML, and then you have like the hashtag and then the ID. And then if you want to apply CSS to multiple things, then you would separate them with commas and basically follow the same structure as before. And then say we want to like style a link. If we want to apply CSS to a link, like for every link that's on the page, we do like color and then blue and then text decoration none. So what if we only want to change the link when someone hovers over it? Then we would use the pseudo selector of hover. So it'd be a and then colon hover, and this will only apply, these rules will only apply when you're hovering over the tag. If you want to select it or change the rules once the mouse is currently clicked on it, you have A:active, and then the same thing. And then what if we want to change the link to change the link if it's been visited before, then we do A:visited, and then we add the rules below that. But yeah, these are kind of like a semi cheat sheet about how you can like very common CSS selectors or CSS properties that you can use to change how things look. We didn't really go too much into size and spacing, but we'll get into that more next lecture. Yeah, and then if you want to like have like rounded corners or something, there's like something called the border radius that will round off. Like if you have like a rectangle, you can round it off into a circle with a big enough border radius. Yeah. Yeah, so most of the colors we've been using have been like default colors like blue, green. If you want like a specific color, then you can go like just search Google like color picker, and then when you put it in, you can like drag the color to whatever you want, and there'll be a hex code. So basically, like even though the hex code looks kind of like weird, basically it'll be the same syntax as before. We do like color : blue, but instead of you'd be like color : and you paste in the hex code and then the semicolon. But yeah, that's pretty much how you have custom colors. And then here are just some helpful links if you want some more practice, or if you want to like look more about pseudo selectors. Here's a fun game, and then here are just more properties that you might be interested in. But yeah, feel free to reference the slideshow whenever you're working on homeworks or labs. CSS, most of it is just like figuring out what you forgot in the previous, like previously. So feel free to reference it. But yeah, that's it for the programming lecture. And then Kelly will take it off with the design lecture next.